Picture this: a small coffin, barely 4 feet long. Inside, the skeletal remains of a girl, 14 years old. But this wasn't just any burial. Her bones tell a story that will make your blood run cold. The pelvic bones are fractured. Shattered, actually. The skull of an infant, her infant lodged between them. Stuck. Trapped. For hours, maybe days, she screamed. She bled. And then, silence. This grave was discovered in 2019 during an excavation of a medieval cemetery in Bologna, Italy. The archaeologists knew immediately what they were looking at. Obstructed labor. A death sentence in the 14th century. A death sentence for a child. Now, here's the part that should disturb you even more. This wasn't rare. This wasn't unusual. This was expected. 1 in 3 women died from pregnancy-related causes in medieval Europe. 1 in 3. But those numbers don't tell the whole story, because we're not just talking about women. We're talking about girls. 12 years old, 13, 14, married off the moment they bled. Pregnant before their bodies were ready. Dead before they could even understand what a life was supposed to be. History classes don't teach you this. The textbooks skip over it. They'll tell you about kings and conquests, about knights and crusades, about the glory of medieval courts. But they won't tell you about the birthing chambers. They won't tell you about the blood-soaked beds. They won't tell you about the girls who wrote their wills at 13, knowing full well they might not survive their wedding night's consequences. Why? Because the truth is ugly. The truth is that behind every golden crown and every grand castle, there were children, literal children, being sacrificed on the altar of legacy, of heirs, of power. Their bodies were currency. Their suffering was policy. Their deaths were acceptable. This isn't a story about tragedy. This is a story about a system. A system that looked at a 12-year-old girl and saw a womb. A system that married her off to men twice, sometimes 3 times her age. A system that got her pregnant, watched her body fail, and then did it all over again with the next girl. And the worst part? Everyone knew. The families knew. The church knew. The kings and queens knew. They all knew, and they all let it happen. I'm bringing you the truth that crowns tried to bury. This is Throne of Lies, and for the next 40 minutes you're going to see exactly what medieval childbirth really looked like. Not the sanitized version. Not the romanticized version. The version where girls screamed for days in darkened rooms. Where babies were cut from dying mothers. Where survival was the exception, not the rule. Welcome to the brutal reality of medieval childbirth. Let's start with the children they called brides. June 1455. A 12-year-old girl named Margaret Beaufort stood in a chapel, trembling. Not from cold. From fear. She was about to marry Edmund Tudor, a man twice her age, 24 years old to her 12. The wedding vows were spoken. The ceremony concluded. And that night her childhood ended. 9 months later, Margaret gave birth. She was 13 years old. Her body wasn't ready. Her pelvis hadn't finished developing. The labor was agony. It lasted for hours, and when it was finally over, when her son Henry was born, Margaret's body was destroyed. Permanently. She would never have another child. The damage was too severe. But here's what you need to understand. Margaret was royalty. She had access to the best midwives, the finest care available in all of England. And even with all of that privilege, her body was ruined at 13. Now imagine the peasant girls. The ones with no names in the history books. No midwives. No care. Just pain, blood, and very often death. This was medieval Europe. And this was normal. The age of consent didn't exist the way we understand it today. There was no legal protection, no safeguard for children. Instead, there was one simple rule. If a girl had her first period, she was ready for marriage. Ready for sex. Ready for pregnancy. The moment blood appeared, she became a commodity. 12 years old. 13. Sometimes even younger. Let me give you more examples because Margaret Beaufort wasn't an exception. Isabella of Valois was 6 years old when she was married to King Richard II of England. 6. The marriage was political, a treaty sealed in the blood of a child. But the truly horrific part came 7 years later. At 13, the marriage was consummated. A 29-year-old king and a 13-year-old girl. The records don't tell us what Isabella thought, what she felt, whether she cried. History doesn't care about that. History only cared that the alliance was secured. Joan of England, daughter of King Henry II, was sent away at 11 to marry the King of Sicily. 11 years old, shipped across Europe like cargo, handed over to a man she'd never met. She was pregnant by 14, dead by 15. Childbirth. Her name is barely a footnote now. These weren't isolated incidents. These were the daughters of kings, queens, and emperors. The most powerful families in Europe were doing this. Openly. Proudly. They signed contracts, negotiated dowries, and handed over children. So why? Why did families rush to marry off their daughters the moment they started bleeding? Money. Plain and simple. A daughter was a financial burden. She needed to be fed, clothed, and protected. But the moment she was married, she became someone else's responsibility. Her father saved money. Her husband gained a womb, a vessel for heirs. That's all she was, a transaction. And if the girl died in childbirth, well, there were always more daughters, more wombs, more transactions. But surely the church stopped this, right? The institution that preached mercy and compassion? The church that claimed to protect the innocent? No, the Catholic Church enabled it. The church set the rules, and the rules were clear. A girl could marry as soon as she reached puberty. Canon law explicitly allowed it. Priests blessed these unions. They stood at the altar and watched 12-year-old girls marry grown men, and they called it holy. They called it God's will. There were no protests, no outcry, no reformers demanding change. Because in medieval Europe, this was how society functioned. Girls were not children. They were future mothers. And their value was measured entirely by their ability to produce heirs. But here's the part that should make you furious. Biology didn't care about canon law. Biology didn't care about dowries or alliances or heirs. Biology had its own rules, and those rules were being ignored. A 13-year-old girl is not physically ready to carry a child. Her body is still growing. Her bones are still developing. The pelvis, the structure that needs to open wide enough to allow a baby to pass through, doesn't fully mature until a woman is 18 to 20 years old. Sometimes older. At 12, at 13, at 14, that pelvis is too small, too narrow. And when a girl that young gets pregnant, when labor begins, the baby can't fit. The bones can't spread wide enough. The baby gets stuck. And when that happens, the girl dies. Slowly, painfully, screaming for days while her body tries and fails to do something it was never ready to do. Medieval doctors didn't understand this. They didn't know about pelvic development or skeletal maturity. They didn't know about obstetric mechanics. What they believed was worse than ignorance. They believed that women were smaller, weaker versions of men. They believed that pregnancy was caused by an imbalance of humors. They believed that a difficult labor was God's punishment for sin. So when a 13-year-old girl went into labor and couldn't deliver, the doctors didn't blame her age. They didn't blame the system that married her off too young. They blamed her, her body, her weakness, her sins. The girls who survived carried the trauma forever. We have letters, diaries, fragments of their voices. Margaret Beaufort wrote later in life about the fear she felt during her pregnancy. She described the terror of knowing she might die. She was 13 years old and writing goodbye letters to her family. Other survivors were less fortunate. Obstetric fistulas, tears in the tissue between the vagina and bladder or rectum, left women incontinent, leaking urine or feces constantly. They were cast out by their husbands, shunned by society, left to suffer alone. Many killed themselves. The ones who didn't lived in agony, their bodies broken before they'd even finished growing. And the girls who didn't survive, they were replaced. Quickly, quietly. Their husbands remarried within months, sometimes weeks. A new girl, a new womb. The system kept running. This is what medieval marriage looked like when you strip away the fairy tales and the romance. This is what happened when society decided that girls were ready for motherhood the moment they bled. If you're shocked by what child brides endured, imagine how many stories like this are still untold. We're on a mission to expose every brutal truth history tried to bury, but we need your help to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. These girls had no voice. You can give them one by hitting that subscribe button. Don't let their suffering be forgotten. Now, let's talk about what happened when these child brides went into labor. Let's talk about the birthing chambers, because what you're about to hear is worse than anything you've imagined. The contractions started at dawn. A 14-year-old girl, 6 months into her marriage, clutched her swollen belly and knew what was coming. The women were summoned. Her mother, if she was lucky, the midwife, the neighbors. They led her to the birthing chamber, and once she crossed that threshold, there was no turning back. The windows were sealed, every single one, covered with heavy cloth, blocked with wooden shutters, ensuring not a single ray of sunlight could enter. The room was plunged into darkness, lit only by flickering candles. This wasn't ambience. This was protocol. Medieval medical theory demanded it. They believed fresh air carried diseases, that light would harm the mother and child. So they locked her in a suffocating, airless room and told her to push. She would stay in that room for hours, sometimes days, and if things went wrong, she would die there. No men were allowed inside. Not her husband, not her father, and critically, not doctors. The birthing chamber was an exclusively female space. Midwives ran the show, assisted by gossips, female friends and relatives who attended the birth. This might sound empowering, a sisterhood supporting a woman through labor, but the reality was far more complicated. Most midwives had no formal training. They learned through observation, through trial and error, through watching other women die. They had no understanding of anatomy, no knowledge of infection, no tools beyond their hands. And when those hands weren't enough, when the birth went wrong, there was nothing they could do but watch. But they didn't just watch. They prayed. They chanted. They performed rituals that had nothing to do with medicine and everything to do with desperation. Eagle stones were placed on the laboring woman's abdomen. These were hollow rocks that rattled when shaken, believed to have magical properties because they resembled eggs. The theory was that just as the stone could release the smaller stone inside, the woman's body would release the baby. It didn't work. It never worked, but they kept doing it. Holy relics were brought in. Fragments of saints' bones, scraps of cloth supposedly touched by the Virgin Mary, vials of holy water. These items were pressed against the woman's belly, placed under her pillow, waved over her body while prayers were recited. Priests blessed special girdles, belts that women wore during labor, inscribed with prayers and images of saints. The belief was that divine intervention could ease the birth. Couldn't. Prayer scrolls were unrolled and laid across the woman's stomach. Long parchments covered in Latin text, verses from the Bible, invocations to God and the saints. The women in the room would read them aloud, over and over, while the girl screamed. And she did scream. For hours. For days. Because there was no pain relief. None. No drugs. No herbs strong enough to dull the agony. And even if such remedies existed, the church forbade their use. Genesis 3 verse 16. Every medieval Christian knew it by heart. In pain you shall bring forth children. God's curse on Eve for her sin in the Garden of Eden. Pain in childbirth wasn't just expected, it was required. It was penance. It was holy. To try to ease that pain was to defy God's will. So the women suffered. They screamed until their voices gave out, until they couldn't scream anymore, until all that was left were weak, gasping sobs. And then, for some of them, things got worse. Obstructed labor. 2 words that meant a death sentence in medieval Europe. When a child's pelvis is too small, when the baby can't fit through the birth canal, labor stops. The contractions continue, violent and relentless, but the baby doesn't move. It's stuck, trapped between bone and flesh, unable to go forward, unable to go back. The girl keeps pushing. Her body keeps trying. Hours pass. The midwife checks, feels the baby's position, realizes the truth. This baby isn't coming out. Not on its own. 12 hours become 24. 24 become 48. The girl stops eating. She can't keep food down. She vomits bile. Her strength fades. She's drenched in sweat, shaking, delirious with pain and exhaustion. The women around her keep praying, keep chanting, keep pressing holy relics to her skin. But nothing changes. The baby is still stuck. 3 days. That's how long some girls labored before they died. 72 hours of continuous agony. Their bodies trying to expel a child that physically could not pass through. The tissue tears. Blood vessels rupture. Infection sets in. And eventually the girl's heart just stops. Her body gives up. But sometimes before that happened, the men were finally called in. Not to save her. To save the baby. Barber-surgeons, the closest thing medieval Europe had to obstetricians, would be summoned when it became clear the mother was dying. They brought with them a tool that should never have existed. A tool designed for one purpose, to extract a living child from a dying mother. Or, more often, to extract a dead baby so the mother might survive. Craniotomy. The procedure involved inserting a sharp hook or blade into the birth canal, piercing the baby's skull, and collapsing it, crushing the head so it could be pulled out piece by piece. This was done without anesthesia. The mother was fully conscious, fully aware of what was happening. She could feel every cut, every pull, every fragment of her child being removed from her body. If the baby was already dead, this was the only option. Let the dead infant remain inside, and the mother would die from infection within days. But if the baby was still alive, then a choice had to be made. Church doctrine was clear. The baby's soul mattered more than the mother's life. An unbaptized infant dying meant eternal damnation, a soul lost forever. But the mother, she'd already been baptized. Her soul was secure. So if it came down to a choice, the answer was simple. Save the baby. Let the mother die. Records show that barber-surgeons followed this rule. When faced with an impossible birth, they prioritized the infant. They performed the craniotomy on the mother, cutting through her tissue to widen the canal, even if it killed her. Because a living baby was worth more than a living woman. Most of the time, both died anyway. But let's say the craniotomy worked. Let's say the baby was removed, and the mother survived the procedure. She still wasn't safe. Because the leading cause of maternal death wasn't obstructed labor. It was what came after. Hemorrhaging. Uncontrolled bleeding that turned the birthing chamber into a slaughterhouse. The medieval understanding of blood loss was primitive at best. They believed blood was one of the 4 humors, that losing some was natural, even healthy. So when a woman started bleeding after birth, the midwives didn't panic. Not at first. They let it flow, believing her body was purging itself. By the time they realized something was wrong, it was too late. The girl was pale, cold, barely conscious. Her pulse was weak, her breathing shallow. They tried to stop the bleeding with pressure, with cloths, with prayer. But medieval midwives didn't understand the physiology of postpartum hemorrhage. They didn't know about uterine atony, about retained placenta, about the need for immediate intervention. So they watched as the girl bled out on the birthing bed, her life draining away in minutes. If she survived the bleeding, infection was waiting. Puerperal fever, childbed fever, an infection of the uterus caused by bacteria introduced during labor. And in medieval Europe, bacteria were everywhere. The midwives didn't wash their hands. They didn't sterilize their tools. They moved from one birth to another, carrying infection with them, spreading it from woman to woman like a plague. The symptoms started a few days after delivery. Fever, chills, abdominal pain. The girl's belly swelled, hot to the touch. She stopped eating, stopped drinking. The fever climbed higher. She became delirious, thrashing in bed, crying out for her mother, for God, for anyone to make it stop. There was no treatment, no antibiotics, no understanding that washing hands could prevent the infection in the first place. The women tried herbal remedies, poultices, more prayers. Nothing worked. The infection spread through her bloodstream, shutting down her organs one by one. Within a week of giving birth, she was dead. The body was removed from the birthing chamber quickly. There were rituals to follow, a funeral to arrange, but there was also another concern: the smell. Decomposition started fast, especially in a hot, airless room. The women washed the corpse, dressed it in clean linen, and prepared it for burial. The priest was called to perform the last rites, though in many cases, those rites had already been given days earlier when it became clear she wouldn't survive. And the baby? If it lived, its chances weren't good. Infant mortality rates were staggering. Babies whose mothers died in childbirth had even lower survival rates. Wet nurses were hired if the family could afford one, but many couldn't. The baby was fed animal milk, which often caused diarrhea and dehydration, or it was given a mixture of bread and water, which provided no nutrition. Most of these infants died within the first year, so the birthing chamber claimed 2 lives, mother and child. The room was cleaned, the blood-stained linens were burned, and within months another girl was brought in, another child bride, another body too young to carry a pregnancy, another chance for the cycle to repeat. This was medieval childbirth. This was the reality that history books gloss over. And we're just getting started. Money couldn't save them. Power couldn't save them. Royal blood couldn't save them. When childbirth went wrong in medieval Europe, it didn't matter if you wore a crown or rags. Your body was just as vulnerable. Your screams sounded exactly the same. And your chances of survival were just as slim. But here's what makes the royal cases so damning. These women had everything. The best midwives. The finest physicians. Access to rare medicines and treatments that peasants could never afford. They had private birthing chambers, not filthy hovels. They had servants attending to their every need. They had the church praying for their survival. And they still died. Horribly. Publicly. In ways that were documented, recorded, and then conveniently forgotten by history. Let me show you exactly what I mean. Margaret Beaufort. We've already mentioned her. But you need to understand the full scope of what happened to this girl. Born in 1443 to one of England's wealthiest families. By the time she was 7, she was already a valuable political asset. Her family began negotiating marriage contracts immediately. She was betrothed twice before she turned 12. Twice. Before she even understood what marriage meant. Then Edmund Tudor entered the picture. 24 years old. Connected to the royal family through his mother's second marriage. He saw an opportunity, and Margaret's family saw an alliance. The marriage was arranged. She was 12. He was an adult. And nobody thought twice about it. The wedding took place in 1455. Margaret was still a child, barely into puberty, and she was handed over to a grown man. Edmund didn't wait. Records suggest the marriage was consummated immediately. Within months, Margaret was pregnant. At 12 years old, her body was carrying a child it had no capacity to safely deliver. Edmund died before the baby was born. Plague, possibly, or wounds from the conflicts raging across England at the time. So Margaret was alone. 12 years old, pregnant, widowed, and terrified. January 28, 1457. Margaret went into labor. She was 13 years old. The birth took hours. Her pelvis was too small. Her body wasn't developed enough. The midwives worked frantically, but there was only so much they could do. Eventually, the baby came. A boy. Healthy. He would grow up to become King Henry VII, the founder of the Tudor dynasty. But Margaret paid a price that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The damage to her body was catastrophic. Her reproductive system was destroyed. Medical historians believe she suffered severe tearing, possibly a fistula, and permanent damage to her uterine structure. She was 13, and she would never have another child. Never. Her body had been used, broken, and discarded by a system that valued her womb more than her life. The cruelest irony? Margaret lived to be 66 years old. 66. She survived the birth that should have killed her, survived the Wars of the Roses, survived political intrigue and exile. She watched her son become king. She watched her grandson, Henry VIII, ascend the throne. She became one of the most powerful women in England, but she was never whole again. She carried the trauma of that birth for 53 years. Every day was a reminder of what had been done to her when she was just a child. That's Margaret Beaufort, the mother of a dynasty, a survivor, and a victim of a system that saw nothing wrong with marrying off 12-year-olds. Now let's talk about Isabella of Aragon. Different from Margaret in one key way, Isabella was 20 when she married. By medieval standards, that was practically elderly for a first marriage. Most noblewomen were married off in their early teens. But Isabella's situation was complicated by politics, and so her marriage was delayed. In 1490, she married Manuel I of Portugal. The marriage was strategic, designed to strengthen the alliance between Spain and Portugal. Isabella's parents, Ferdinand and Isabella of Castile, yes, the same Isabella who funded Christopher Columbus, needed this union to secure their kingdom's future. And Isabella, their daughter, was the bargaining chip. The pressure on her was immense. She wasn't just a wife. She was a political instrument. Her job was clear: produce heirs. Specifically, produce male heirs. The alliance between Spain and Portugal depended on it. The stability of the Iberian Peninsula depended on it. Everything depended on Isabella's womb. She got pregnant quickly. Good news for the alliance. Terrible news for Isabella. Because even at 20, even with a fully developed body, childbirth in 1498 was still a gamble with death. August 23, 1498. Isabella went into labor. The birth was difficult. The baby was large, the labor prolonged. But eventually a son was born. Miguel. Healthy, alive, and exactly what the alliance needed. Isabella, however, was not so fortunate. She hemorrhaged. Badly. The bleeding wouldn't stop. The midwives tried everything. Pressure, herbs, prayers. Nothing worked. Within hours of giving birth, Isabella of Aragon was dead. 28 years old. Her son, the heir everyone had been waiting for, survived only 2 years before dying himself. Here's the part that should enrage you. Isabella's death was barely recorded. The chroniclers of the time mentioned it in passing. A line or two. The queen died in childbirth. That's it. No details. No acknowledgement of her suffering. No mourning period that lasted more than a few weeks. Because Isabella had done her job. She'd produced a son. The fact that it killed her was irrelevant. Manuel I, her husband, remarried within a year. His new wife, Isabella's own sister, Maria of Aragon. The family didn't even blink. One daughter dead, another one sent to take her place. The alliance continued. The political machine kept running. Isabella was forgotten. That's how much a queen's life was worth when she'd already delivered an heir. Now Jane Seymour. If you know anything about Henry VIII, you know about Jane. She's famous for being the wife he supposedly loved most. The one he was buried next to. The one who gave him what he wanted more than anything: a legitimate male heir. Jane became Henry's third wife in 1536, just 11 days after Anne Boleyn was executed. She was quiet, obedient, everything Anne Boleyn wasn't. Henry was desperate for a son. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, had given him a daughter. Anne Boleyn had given him another daughter. Jane was his last real hope. She got pregnant almost immediately. Henry was ecstatic. Finally, after years of failed marriages and dead infants, he might get his son. The entire kingdom waited. Prayers were said in every church. This baby had to survive. Jane had to survive. October 12, 1537. Jane went into labor. It did not go well. The labor lasted 2 full days. 48 hours of agony while Jane's body struggled to deliver the child. The baby was large. The position was wrong. Jane was exhausted, weak, barely conscious by the end. There's a myth that refuses to die even today, that Henry VIII ordered a cesarean section to save the baby, sacrificing Jane in the process. It's dramatic, it's horrifying, and it's almost certainly false. Cesarean sections on living women were virtually unheard of in the 16th century. The survival rate was nearly 0. No doctor would have attempted it, and no record exists of it happening. What actually happened was worse in its mundanity. Jane delivered naturally after 2 days of hell. The baby, Edward, was born alive, healthy, a boy. Henry finally had his son. The kingdom celebrated. Bells rang. Bonfires were lit. England had a male heir. Jane, however, was dying. She'd survived the birth, but something was wrong. 12 days later, she developed a fever, puerperal fever. The infection spread quickly. Her abdomen swelled. She became delirious. The doctors tried everything they knew, which was nothing useful. Bloodletting, poultices, prayer. October 24th, 1537. Jane Seymour died. She was 28 years old. She'd been queen for 17 months. And she'd done exactly what was expected of her. Given Henry a son, even if it killed her. Henry mourned. Publicly. He wore black. He postponed festivities. He declared her the love of his life. And when he died 10 years later, he was buried next to her at Windsor Castle. Historians love to point to this as proof of his devotion. But let's be clear about what that burial really meant. Henry wasn't buried next to Jane because he loved her more than his other wives. He was buried next to her because she gave him Edward. She succeeded where the others failed. That's what she was worth to him. Not her personality. Not her companionship. Her womb. Her ability to produce the one thing he needed. Jane Seymour died for that. And history calls it a love story. Finally, Catherine Parr. Henry's sixth and final wife. The one who survived him. Catherine is often celebrated as the smart one, the survivor, the woman who outlasted the tyrant. And she did. She nursed Henry through his final years, managed his household, and when he died in 1547, she was free. Free to marry for love. And she did. Thomas Seymour, a charming, ambitious man who'd been courting her before Henry forced her into marriage. Catherine married him quickly, within months of Henry's death. She was 35 years old. She was happy. And then she got pregnant. 36 was old for childbirth in the Tudor era. Very old. Medieval medicine considered women over 35 to be at extreme risk during pregnancy. Fertility declined. Bodies were less resilient. Complications were more common. Catherine knew the risks, but she was in love. She wanted a child with Thomas. So she took the gamble. August 30th, 1548. Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Mary. The delivery was difficult but successful. Catherine survived. For 6 days it seemed like she'd beaten the odds. She was weak, exhausted, but alive. She'd done it. She'd survived Henry VIII. She'd married for love. She'd given birth at 36. Against all odds, Catherine Parr had won. And then the fever came. Puerperal fever. Again. The same infection that killed Jane Seymour. The same infection that killed thousands of women across Europe. Catherine's temperature spiked. She became delirious. She accused Thomas of betraying her, of not loving her, of wanting her dead. The fever was destroying her mind along with her body. September 5th, 1548. Catherine Parr died, 6 days after giving birth. 36 years old. The woman who survived Henry VIII, who navigated one of the most dangerous courts in Europe, who wrote books and influenced religious policy, was killed by childbirth. And here's the final insult. Rumors spread immediately that Thomas Seymour had poisoned her. Poison. As if her death needed a conspiracy to be tragic. As if dying from childbirth wasn't dramatic enough. The rumors persisted for years, even though there was no evidence. Thomas remarried quickly, which didn't help his reputation. Catherine's death was overshadowed by scandal, by gossip, by speculation. She was forgotten. The last wife of Henry VIII, dead from the same thing that killed so many women before her, and nobody cared. Her funeral was small. Her burial was quiet. History moved on. These were queens. Women with power, wealth, access to the best care available in their time. Margaret Beaufort's body destroyed at 13. Isabella of Aragon bleeding out after delivering the heir everyone demanded. Jane Seymour dying 12 days after giving Henry his precious son. Catherine Parr, the survivor, killed by infection after finally finding happiness. If this is what happened to royalty, imagine the peasant girls. Imagine the thousands, the tens of thousands, the hundreds of thousands of women whose names we'll never know, who died in unmarked graves, who were replaced and forgotten within days. These queens had wealth, power, and the best medical care available, and they still died screaming. Imagine the peasant girls whose names we'll never know. Every subscription to Throne of Lies helps us fund the research to uncover more untold stories. Don't scroll past. These women can't speak anymore, but you can make sure their stories are heard. Now let's talk about what medieval doctors actually did when they were finally allowed into the birthing chamber. Let's talk about the treatments that killed as often as they saved. Because what you're about to hear will make you grateful you live in the 21st century. When the screaming wouldn't stop, when the labor dragged on for days, when it became clear that the mother or the baby or both were going to die, the women in the birthing chamber finally made the call they'd been dreading. They sent for the barber-surgeon. Not a doctor, not a trained physician, a barber-surgeon. A man whose primary job was cutting hair and trimming beards. A man who learned surgery the same way he learned to shave faces. Through apprenticeship, through watching, through trial and error on bodies that couldn't afford real medical care. This was the person they trusted with life and death. Barber-surgeons were the lowest rung of medieval medicine. Physicians, the university-educated elite, wouldn't touch surgical procedures. They considered it beneath them. Surgery was manual labor, bloody and crude, something for tradesmen, not scholars. So the barber-surgeons filled the gap. They pulled teeth. They set broken bones. They amputated limbs. And when a woman was dying in childbirth, they were the ones called in to cut her open. Their tools were horrifying. Blades that hadn't been cleaned since the last surgery. Instruments stored in leather pouches, covered in dried blood and tissue from previous patients. Rust wasn't unusual. Sharpness wasn't guaranteed. These men had no concept of sterilization, no understanding that their dirty tools were spreading infection from one body to the next. And when they arrived at a birthing chamber, they brought those tools with them. But before they started cutting, they tried something else. Something that medieval medicine considered essential for treating nearly every ailment: bloodletting. The theory was simple. The body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Disease, pain, and complications arose when these humors became imbalanced. Pregnancy, they believed, created an excess of blood. So when labor went wrong, when the woman was screaming and the baby wouldn't come, the obvious solution was to drain some of that excess blood. They opened a vein in her arm, sometimes her leg, let the blood flow into a bowl, watched as the woman, already weak from days of labor, became weaker still. They believed this would help. They believed removing blood would somehow make her body more capable of delivering the child. It did the opposite. Women who were already on the edge of collapse lost what little strength they had left. Their blood pressure dropped. Their hearts struggled. Many passed out. Some never woke up. But the barber-surgeons kept doing it, kept draining blood from dying women, because their medical textbooks told them it was the right thing to do. And if bloodletting didn't work, they had other options. Worse options. Forceps, the obstetric tool that could save lives or destroy them, depending on who was using them. They were invented in the late 16th century by the Chamberlain family in England, a dynasty of male midwives who kept the design secret for decades. When forceps finally became available to other practitioners, they were hailed as a miracle. Finally, a way to extract a stuck baby without killing the mother. Except in the hands of untrained barber-surgeons, forceps became weapons. The design was simple. Two curved metal blades that could be inserted into the birth canal and positioned around the baby's head. When used correctly with precision and care, they could guide a stuck infant out safely. When used incorrectly, and they were used incorrectly constantly, they crushed skulls. They tore tissue. They caused hemorrhaging that killed women within hours. Barber-surgeons didn't understand the delicate mechanics of forceps application. They didn't know about angles, about pressure, about the need for gentle traction. They just grabbed, pulled, and hoped. If the baby came out alive, success. If the baby came out with a fractured skull, well, at least it came out. If the mother bled to death from internal injuries, that was unfortunate but unavoidable. This was cutting-edge medical technology in the 1600s. This was progress. But forceps were a late addition to the medieval toolkit. For most of the Middle Ages, when a baby couldn't be delivered naturally, there was only one option left. The option that makes modern doctors shudder when they read about it in historical texts. The cesarean section. Except it wasn't called that yet. It was called the last resort. The final attempt. The thing you did when the mother was already dead or dying, when saving her was impossible, and all you could do was try to save the baby. Because here's what you need to understand. In medieval Europe, cesarean sections on living women were a death sentence. Not a high-risk procedure. Not a dangerous operation. A death sentence. The survival rate was less than 1%. Less than 1%. Why? Because medieval medicine had no concept of anesthesia. No antibiotics. No understanding of shock or blood loss. No way to close the wound properly afterward. A cesarean section meant cutting through skin, fat, muscle, and uterus while the woman was fully conscious and screaming. It meant exposing her internal organs to the air, to infection, to contamination. It meant hemorrhaging that couldn't be controlled. And it meant, almost inevitably, death within hours or days. So why did they do it? Why perform a procedure with a near-zero survival rate? Because the Catholic Church demanded it. Church law was explicit. If a pregnant woman was dying, the baby had to be removed and baptized before it died in the womb. An unbaptized soul was damned to limbo for eternity, forever separated from God. That was unacceptable. So even if the mother was still breathing, even if she was conscious and begging them not to, the priests insisted on the cesarean. The procedure was brutal. The woman was held down by multiple people. The barber-surgeon made a vertical incision from below the ribcage to the pubic bone. The woman felt everything. Every cut. Every layer of tissue being sliced open. She screamed until her voice broke, until she passed out from pain or blood loss, until her body finally gave up. If the baby was still alive when they pulled it out, the priest baptized it immediately, splashed holy water on its head, recited the prayers, secured its soul. Then the baby usually died anyway, because premature infants or babies extracted from dying mothers had no chance of survival without modern medicine. And the mother? She was sewn up with whatever thread was available. Catgut, often made from animal intestines. The wound was packed with cloth and left to heal. Except it didn't heal. Infection set in within days. The abdomen swelled, turned red, oozed pus. Fever consumed her. Sepsis shut down her organs. Death was agonizing and inevitable. There are documented cases from the 1500s and 1600s. Women who survived cesareans, or at least survived long enough to have their cases recorded. One woman in Germany lived for 3 days after the procedure. Another in France lasted a week. These were considered medical miracles. 7 days of suffering before death was a miracle. But cesareans were rare. Most dying women never made it to surgery. They died in the birthing chamber surrounded by midwives who had run out of options. And those midwives had been trying everything. Everything. Including remedies that were just as likely to kill as to help. Folk medicine. Herbal treatments passed down through generations. Mixtures that were supposed to speed up labor, ease pain, help the baby come faster. Some of them were harmless. Most of them were useless. A few of them were deadly. Ergot, a fungus that grows on rye and other grains. In small doses, it causes uterine contractions. In slightly larger doses, it causes violent convulsions, gangrene, psychosis, and death. Medieval midwives used it to induce labor or speed up a slow delivery. They had no way to measure dosage. No way to know if the batch they were using was safe or lethal. Women were given ergot, went into uncontrollable contractions that tore their uterus apart, and bled to death internally. Pennyroyal, an herb used to induce menstruation and, in higher doses, to terminate pregnancies. Midwives sometimes gave it to women in obstructed labor, hoping it would restart contractions or expel the baby. Pennyroyal is toxic to the liver, causes organ failure. Women who took it experienced vomiting, seizures, and death. But it was cheap and available, so they kept using it. Arsenic. Yes, arsenic. The poison. Medieval medical texts recommended it for speeding up labor. Small amounts, they said, would stimulate the womb. What actually happened was acute poisoning. Women vomited blood. Their organs shut down. They died in agony while everyone wondered why the medicine hadn't worked. Mercury. Another poison marketed as medicine. Given to pregnant women for a variety of reasons, none of them logical. Mercury poisoning causes neurological damage, kidney failure, and death. But medieval doctors believed it balanced the humors, so they prescribed it anyway. And if herbs and poisons didn't work, there was always physical intervention. And by intervention, I mean violence. Midwives shook laboring women. Violently. The theory was that shaking would dislodge the baby, help it move down the birth canal. What it actually did was cause trauma, distress, and sometimes placental abruption. They hit women, slapped them, punched their abdomens, trying to force the baby out through blunt impact. This caused internal injuries, bruising, and in some cases, rupture of the uterus. They suspended women upside down, literally hung them by their feet, believing gravity would help the baby slide out. Didn't. Caused blood to rush to the head, increased blood pressure, and induced panic. And then there was the birthing chair. It sounds reasonable, almost modern. A chair designed specifically for childbirth, allowing women to labor in an upright position. Gravity-assisted delivery. What could go wrong? Everything. The birthing chair was a wooden seat with a hole in the center. The woman sat on it, legs spread, while midwives crouched below to catch the baby. Sounds functional. But the chair had no back support. Women, already exhausted from hours of labor, had to hold themselves upright through sheer muscle strength. Their backs ached. Their legs cramped. They couldn't lie down, couldn't rest, couldn't shift position. And if labor lasted too long, if the baby didn't come quickly, the woman's body gave out. She collapsed forward or sideways, often injuring herself in the fall. The chair became a torture device. Women begged to be moved to a bed, but midwives refused. Tradition demanded the birthing chair. So the women stayed, suffering, until the baby finally came or death arrived first. This was medieval medicine. This was what passed for treatment. Bloodletting. Forceps wielded by butchers. Cesarean sections without anesthesia. Poisonous herbs. Physical violence. Torture devices. And through all of it, the women screamed. They begged for help. They prayed for death. And most of the time, death came. But let's talk about the ones who survived. The ones who lived through the birthing chamber, through the infections, through the incompetent treatments. Because surviving childbirth didn't mean escaping unscathed. It meant carrying the trauma forever. Imagine being 13 years old and writing your own will. Not as a school exercise. Not as a hypothetical. Writing it because, you genuinely know that you might be dead within the year. That was the reality for child brides in medieval Europe. The moment an engagement was announced, the moment a wedding date was set, girls began preparing for their deaths. They wrote wills. They said goodbyes. They made peace with God. Because everyone around them, every woman they knew, had a story about someone who didn't survive childbirth. Their mothers told them. Their aunts. Their older sisters, if they were still alive. The statistics weren't hidden. They were common knowledge. 1 in 3 women died from pregnancy-related causes. 1 in 3. Those weren't abstract numbers. They were neighbors, cousins, friends, girls who'd been alive last year and were buried now. So when a 12-year-old was told she'd be married in 3 months, she didn't think about romance. She didn't dream about her wedding day. She thought about the birthing chamber. She thought about the screaming. She thought about her own funeral. The fear started immediately. The engagement period became a countdown to potential death. Every day that passed brought her closer to the wedding night, closer to pregnancy, closer to labor. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't eat. She spent her time in churches, praying, begging God to let her survive what was coming. And she wrote her will. By candlelight, with shaking hands, a 13-year-old girl divided up her possessions. Her jewelry to her sister, her prayer book to her mother. Her dowry, if she died, would revert to her family or go to the church. She signed it, sealed it, handed it to her father. And then she went to her wedding. Some of them wrote letters too. Final messages to their families. If I don't survive the birth, please tell my mother I love her. If I die, please take care of my child. I'm so afraid. I don't want to die. These letters still exist, preserved in archives, written in the careful, shaky handwriting of children who knew they were condemned. Margaret Beaufort wrote such letters. At 13, pregnant and terrified, she prepared for death. She made arrangements for her unborn child. She said her goodbyes. She survived, but the trauma of those months, that certainty that she was going to die, stayed with her forever. This was the psychological state of child brides, living under a death sentence from the moment they hit puberty. Every wedding was a potential funeral. Every pregnancy was Russian roulette. And there was no escape, no way to refuse, no way to delay. They were trapped. Now imagine surviving. Imagine going through that terror, through labor, through the pain and the blood and the certainty of death, and somehow living. You'd think that would be the end of it. You'd think survival meant freedom. Didn't, because the injuries didn't heal. The damage didn't go away. And medieval society had no patience for broken women. Obstetric fistulas. If you survived obstructed labor, if your body was torn apart during delivery, if the baby was stuck for days pressing against your tissue, you developed fistulas. Holes. Tears in the wall between your vagina and your bladder, or between your vagina and your rectum. And once those tears formed, they didn't close. They couldn't close. Medieval medicine had no way to repair them. So you leaked. Constantly. Urine dripped down your legs. Feces seeped through. You smelled. You couldn't control it. No amount of washing helped. The leakage was constant, humiliating, inescapable. Your husband abandoned you. Your family couldn't stand to be near you. Society cast you out. Women with fistulas were considered unclean, disgusting, cursed by God. They were forced out of their homes, left to beg on the streets, shunned by everyone they'd ever known. There are records of these women, descriptions of them sitting in corners of churches, wrapped in rags, reeking of waste. People threw food at them from a distance, unwilling to get close. Priests prayed over them but wouldn't touch them. They lived in isolation, in shame, in constant physical discomfort, for years, decades, until they finally died, usually from infection or starvation. This was the reward for surviving childbirth. This was what awaited women whose bodies broke during delivery. And the psychological damage was just as severe. PTSD wasn't a diagnosis in medieval Europe, but the symptoms were there. Women who survived traumatic births developed crippling anxiety. They couldn't sleep. They had nightmares about the birthing chamber. They flinched at the sight of pregnant women. They broke down crying at the sound of a baby's cry. Depression consumed them. They stopped eating, stopped speaking, sat in dark rooms staring at walls. Medieval physicians called it melancholy and prescribed useless treatments. More bloodletting, more herbs, more prayer. Nothing worked. The trauma was too deep, and the fear of future pregnancies was paralyzing. Women who'd barely survived one birth knew they might not survive another. Every time their husband approached them, every time pregnancy became a possibility, the terror returned. They begged not to get pregnant again. They tried folk remedies to prevent conception, herbs, amulets, anything that might work. But their husbands didn't care. The church didn't care. A wife's duty was to provide children. Her fear, her trauma, her broken body, none of that mattered. She was forced into repeated pregnancies whether she wanted them or not. Some women became pregnant 5, 6, 7 times. Each pregnancy was another roll of the dice. Each labor brought back the memories of the last one. And each time the odds got worse. Bodies that had been damaged once were more likely to be damaged again. Women who survived their first birth often didn't survive their third or fourth. There are documented cases of women who had 6 pregnancies and died on the 7th. Women who begged their husbands to stop, who pleaded with priests for dispensation, who tried everything to avoid another pregnancy. It didn't matter. They were forced to keep trying until their bodies finally gave out. And then there were the women whose babies didn't survive. The ones who went through all of that pain, all of that trauma, and had nothing to show for it but a tiny corpse. Stillbirth rates in medieval Europe were staggering. 1 in 4 babies died during or shortly after birth. 1 in 4. Mothers labored for hours, for days, screaming and bleeding and praying, only to deliver a dead infant. No cry, no breath, just silence. The blame fell on them immediately. Something they'd done wrong, something they'd eaten, some sin they'd committed. Medieval society believed that stillbirths were God's punishment. So mothers who lost babies weren't comforted. They were interrogated. What had they done to deserve this? Why had God taken the child? The church made it worse. Unbaptized babies couldn't enter heaven. Catholic doctrine was clear. Without baptism, the soul was condemned to limbo. Eternal separation from God. Not hell but not salvation either. Just emptiness. Forever. Mothers whose babies died before or during birth carried that guilt for the rest of their lives. They'd failed to bring the child into the world alive. They'd failed to get it baptized. They'd condemned their own baby's soul. The psychological weight of that belief was crushing. And it happened repeatedly. Women who lost one baby often lost several. There are records of mothers who had 8 pregnancies and buried 6 infants. 6. Each one a separate trauma. Each one blamed on them. Each one another unbaptized soul in limbo. The grief was unbearable. But they weren't allowed to grieve. They were expected to try again immediately. Get pregnant. Deliver. If the baby died, try again. Keep trying until one survived. Your feelings didn't matter. Your trauma didn't matter. Your purpose was reproduction. Nothing else. Some women broke completely. They stopped speaking, stopped moving, sat catatonic in their rooms while their families tried to figure out what to do with them. Medieval medicine called it brain fever or madness. Modern psychology would call it a complete mental breakdown. Others killed themselves, threw themselves from windows, drowned themselves in rivers, took poison. The church condemned suicide as a mortal sin, but for women who'd lost multiple babies, who'd been blamed and shamed and forced into pregnancy after pregnancy, death was the only escape. This was the psychological reality of medieval childbirth. The terror before, the trauma after, the guilt, the shame, the forced repetition of an experience that had nearly killed you, the knowledge that your body was broken, that your babies might die, that society blamed you for all of it. Surviving the birthing chamber wasn't freedom. It was just the beginning of a different kind of hell. But let's step back. Let's ask the question that should be obvious by now. Why did society allow this to happen? Why did everyone, families, doctors, priests, kings, look at this system and decide it was acceptable? They knew. That's the part you need to understand. They knew girls were dying. They knew the bodies were piling up. They knew that marrying off 12-year-olds was a death sentence. Everyone knew. The families burying their daughters. The priests performing funeral rites. The midwives washing blood off their hands. The kings watching their wives die one after another. They all knew. And they let it happen anyway. Why? Because the system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Girls dying in childbirth wasn't a flaw. It was an acceptable cost. The price of doing business. And society had built an entire framework of justifications to make sure nobody questioned it. Start with God. Because in medieval Europe, everything started with God. Genesis 3 verse 16. Every Christian knew the verse. I will greatly multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. God's curse on Eve for eating the forbidden fruit. Punishment for original sin. And according to the church, that punishment extended to every woman who came after. Pain in childbirth wasn't a medical problem to solve. It was divine justice. Suffering during labor wasn't something to prevent. It was something women deserved. Every scream, every hour of agony, every girl who died on the birthing bed, all of it was part of God's plan. The church preached this constantly. Priests reminded women that their suffering was ordained by God, that trying to ease the pain was defying divine will, that accepting the agony with grace and humility was the only righteous path. Pain was holy. Pain was necessary. Pain was how women atoned for Eve's sin. And if you died, even better. Dying in childbirth became romanticized as noble sacrifice. Martyrdom. You gave your life to bring another soul into the world. You fulfilled your purpose as a woman. You died doing God's work. The church elevated maternal death to something sacred, something beautiful. Dead mothers were sometimes venerated, not officially canonized, but celebrated in local communities. Stories spread about women who died in childbirth and were immediately granted entrance to heaven. Their suffering on earth was rewarded with eternal glory. Their deaths weren't tragedies. They were triumphs. This narrative served a purpose. It made women compliant. If dying in childbirth was holy, if it guaranteed salvation, why would you resist? Why would you refuse marriage, refuse pregnancy, refuse your God-given role? The church had weaponized theology to ensure women accepted their fate. And the system worked. Girls walked into birthing chambers knowing they might die, and they went willingly because the alternative, defying God, was worse than death. But theology alone wasn't enough. Religion justified the suffering, but economics drove it. Medieval society was obsessed with heirs, specifically, male heirs. Kingdoms, titles, land, wealth, all of it passed through bloodlines. And bloodlines required children, lots of them. Because infant mortality was so high that you needed multiple children just to ensure one survived to adulthood. The phrase an heir and a spare wasn't a joke. It was policy. You needed at least 2 sons. One to inherit. One as backup in case the first died. And if you wanted security, you needed more. 3 sons. For as many as possible. But sons didn't appear out of nowhere. You needed wombs. And wombs were property. Women in medieval Europe had no value outside their reproductive capacity. A daughter was worth what she could produce. Her intelligence didn't matter. Her talents didn't matter. Her feelings definitely didn't matter. All that mattered was her ability to get pregnant and deliver live children. So families controlled wombs the same way they controlled land. They arranged marriages to secure alliances, to combine estates, to produce heirs. A 12-year-old girl was just another asset to be traded, negotiated, sold to the highest bidder. And if that asset broke, if the girl died in childbirth, you replaced her. Simple as that. Widowers remarried within months, sometimes weeks. There was no mourning period, no time to grieve. The womb was empty, and it needed to be filled. So another girl was found, another marriage arranged, another pregnancy initiated. The machine kept running. Records show noblemen who went through 4, 5, 6 wives. Not because of divorce or annulment, because they kept dying in childbirth. Each one buried, each one replaced. The husbands showed no hesitation. Why would they? Women were interchangeable. One womb was as good as another, and younger brides were preferred. Not just because they were more fertile, though that was part of it. Younger girls came with larger dowries. Their families were eager to marry them off, to shed the financial burden. So they offered more money, more land, more incentives. A 12-year-old bride was cheaper and more lucrative than a 20-year-old. That's what it came down to. Economics. The value of a girl's life was measured against the cost of her dowry and the potential heirs she could produce. If she died producing those heirs, well, at least she'd done her job. The investment paid off. The system continued. But surely medicine could have helped. Surely doctors could have done something to reduce the death toll. No, because medieval medicine was worse than useless. It was actively harmful. And the reasons for that go beyond simple ignorance. Medieval doctors believed in the 4 humors theory. Blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Health was a balance of these 4 substances. Disease was an imbalance. Pregnancy created excess blood, so treatments focused on draining it. Bloodletting, leeches, cutting women open to let the bad blood flow out. It was nonsense, complete nonsense. but it was the foundation of medieval medicine, taught in every university, practiced by every physician. And nobody questioned it because questioning medical authority meant questioning centuries of tradition. Doctors had no understanding of infection. None. They didn't know that bacteria existed. They didn't know that washing hands could save lives. They moved from one patient to another, from one birth to another, carrying disease on their unwashed instruments and filthy hands. In the 1840s, well after the medieval period, a doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis discovered that hand-washing reduced maternal mortality. His colleagues mocked him, ridiculed him, destroyed his career, because the idea that doctors were spreading death was too offensive to accept. If that's how the medical community reacted in the 19th century, imagine how medieval doctors would have responded. They wouldn't have. They couldn't have, because the church controlled medical knowledge, and the church forbade the study of anatomy. Dissection was banned. Cutting open human bodies to study them was considered desecration of God's creation. Doctors learned anatomy from ancient Greek texts, texts that were often wrong, texts that described bodies they'd never actually seen. They had no first-hand knowledge of how women's reproductive systems worked. They couldn't study pregnant corpses to understand complications. They couldn't learn from their mistakes because examining the dead was a sin. So medical progress stopped. For centuries, doctors repeated the same errors, prescribed the same useless treatments, killed the same women in the same ways, because the church refused to let them learn. And when someone did figure out a better way, when a midwife discovered a technique that actually saved lives, she was accused of witchcraft. Midwives were caught in an impossible position. They weren't trained by universities. They learned through apprenticeship, through experience, through oral tradition passed from woman to woman. Some of them became very skilled. They knew tricks that male doctors didn't. They understood labor mechanics better than physicians who'd never touched a pregnant woman. But that knowledge made them dangerous. Women who knew too much. Women who had power over life and death. Women who didn't need male authority to do their jobs. The church targeted them, especially during the witch hunts. Midwives were accused of causing stillbirths, of cursing babies, of making secret pacts with the devil. Thousands were tried, tortured, burned at the stake. Their knowledge died with them. The irony is savage. The few people who actually knew how to help women in childbirth were systematically eliminated. And the male doctors who replaced them knew nothing, did nothing, and killed more women than any accused which ever did. So this is why society allowed it to happen. Theology made suffering holy. Economics made women replaceable. Medicine was deliberately kept ignorant. And anyone who tried to change the system was destroyed. The deaths weren't accidental. They weren't unavoidable. They were the result of deliberate choices. A society that valued heirs over mothers. A church that valued doctrine over lives. An economic system that treated women as livestock. And it worked. For centuries, thousands of years, millions of dead women, millions of dead babies, all of it accepted, all of it normalized, all of it justified. But there were exceptions. Rare, incredibly rare. Women who survived when they shouldn't have, who beat the odds, who lived long enough to tell their stories. Let's talk about them, because their survival reveals something important about what actually helped versus what society claimed helped. 10 pregnancies. 10. Eleanor of Aquitaine survived 10 pregnancies and lived to be 82 years old. In an era where 1 in 3 women died from childbirth complications, where teenage brides were buried with their unborn children, Eleanor had 10 babies and died of old age. How? What did she know that other women didn't? What made her different? The answer is going to make you angry, because it wasn't magic. It wasn't divine favor. It wasn't some secret medieval technique lost to history. Eleanor survived for 3 simple reasons. She married late, she ate well, and she was lucky. That's it. That's the secret. And it was available to almost no one. Eleanor of Aquitaine was born in 1122 to one of the wealthiest families in France. She inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine at 15, making her the most desirable bride in Europe. She married Louis VII of France when she was 15, not 12. not 13, 15. And crucially, she didn't get pregnant immediately. Her first child was born when she was 23. 23. Her pelvis was fully developed. Her body was mature. She was physically ready for pregnancy in a way that 12-year-old girls simply weren't. That head start saved her life. She went on to have 10 children total. 8 with her second husband, Henry II of England. 10 pregnancies spread over more than 20 years. And she survived every single one. No obstructed labor. No fatal hemorrhaging. No puerperal fever. She gave birth, recovered, and lived to see her children grow up, fight wars, become kings and queens themselves. Eleanor died in 1204, over 60 years after her first pregnancy. She outlived most of her children. She outlived both of her husbands. She was a political powerhouse, a cultural icon, a woman who shaped European history. And none of it would have been possible if she'd been married off at 12 like so many others. Her survival wasn't a miracle. It was privilege. She had access to the best food available: meat, fresh vegetables, dairy, bread. Her body was well-nourished, strong, capable of handling the physical demands of pregnancy. She had the best midwives, the cleanest birthing chambers, servants who could care for her during recovery. And most importantly, she was old enough. Her body was ready. Isabella of Castile. You know her name. The queen who funded Christopher Columbus. The woman who unified Spain. She had 5 pregnancies, all after the age of 20. All successful. All survived by both mother and child. Isabella married Ferdinand of Aragon when she was 18. Her first child was born when she was 20. Her body was ready. She was well-fed, well cared for, surrounded by the best medical support available. And she survived. 5 children. 5 successful pregnancies. In a time when women were dying left and right, Isabella walked away from every birth alive and intact. Not because she was blessed by God, though her supporters certainly claimed that, but because she had the advantages that most women didn't: wealth, nutrition, and a body that had finished developing before it was forced to carry a child. These were the exceptions, the outliers, women who survived because they had resources, because they married later, because they got lucky. But their stories reveal the truth. It wasn't impossible to survive childbirth in medieval Europe. It was just impossible for most women. Because most women were poor. Most women were malnourished. Most women were married off at 12 or 13, their bodies too young, their chances too slim. Eleanor and Isabella survived because they avoided the traps that killed everyone else. But there's another group that deserves attention. Another set of exceptions that society worked very hard to erase. The midwives who actually knew what they were doing. The women who saved lives not through prayer or superstition, but through knowledge, skill, and techniques that worked. Trotula of Salerno, a name that should be famous but isn't. A medieval female physician who practiced in the 11th century at the medical school of Salerno in Italy. She wrote extensively about women's health, obstetrics, gynecology. Her texts were copied and circulated for centuries. And she knew things, real things, useful things, techniques that could save lives. Trotula understood that childbirth positions mattered. She recommended letting women labor in positions that felt comfortable rather than forcing them into the rigid, upright birthing chair. She understood that squatting, kneeling, or lying on their side could ease labor. This was revolutionary. Male doctors insisted on the birthing chair. Trotula said, listen to the woman's body. She wrote about the importance of cleanliness. Not in terms of bacteria, germ theory wouldn't exist for another 800 years, but she recognized that clean hands, clean linens, and clean instruments led to better outcomes. She couldn't explain why, but she observed the pattern and documented it. She understood perineal massage. She taught midwives to use oils to soften the tissue around the birth canal, to gently stretch it during labor to prevent tearing. This technique reduced the severity of injuries, reduced the risk of fistulas, and helped women recover faster. Male doctors didn't do this. They didn't even consider it. But Trotula knew. She documented signs of obstructed labor and advised when to call for help, when to try alternative positions, when to recognize that a birth was going wrong before it became fatal. She saved lives with this knowledge. And she trained other women. Her texts were teaching tools. Midwives across Europe read them, learned from them, used her techniques. For centuries, Trotula's knowledge circulated through underground networks of female practitioners. But here's what happened to her legacy. Male physicians rewrote her work. They claimed it was too advanced to have been written by a woman. They attributed it to male doctors. They erased her name from manuscripts. By the Renaissance, many scholars believe Trotula never existed, that she was just a fictional character invented to give authority to women's medical texts. They couldn't accept that a woman had understood obstetrics better than they did. So they erased her. They stole her knowledge, repackaged it under male names, and pretended she'd never existed. And Trotula wasn't alone. There were other midwives, other women who figured out what worked. They discovered that patience saved lives. That letting labor progress naturally was often better than intervention. That experienced hands could feel a baby's position, could gently guide it into the right alignment. That certain herbs genuinely helped. Not the poisonous ones, but gentle tonics that eased pain or strengthened contractions without causing harm. This knowledge existed. It was real. It worked. But it was suppressed, ignored, actively rejected by male-dominated medicine. Why? Misogyny. Pure and simple. Male doctors couldn't tolerate the idea that women, especially uneducated women, might know more than they did. It threatened their authority. It undermined their status. So they dismissed midwives as ignorant, superstitious, dangerous. They pushed for male doctors to take over childbirth entirely. And when male doctors took over, mortality rates went up. Because male doctors used forceps incorrectly. Because they didn't wash their hands. Because they prioritized speed over safety. Because they treated childbirth as a mechanical problem to be solved with tools rather than a natural process to be supported with skill. The irony is brutal. The people who actually knew how to help were pushed aside. The people who killed more women were given authority. And society celebrated this as progress. So here's what we know. Survival was possible. Women like Eleanor and Isabella proved it. Skilled midwives like Trotula proved it. Later marriages, better nutrition, experienced care. These things saved lives. The answers existed. But the system didn't want answers. The system wanted heirs. And if women died producing them, that was acceptable. Even when solutions were right there, even when knowledge existed that could save lives, society chose not to use it. Chose to keep marrying off children. Chose to keep prioritizing male authority over female expertise. Chose to keep the death toll climbing. Because saving women's lives was never the goal. Now we've reached the end. We've seen the child brides writing their wills. We've seen the birthing chambers soaked in blood. We've seen the queens dying despite their wealth and power. We've seen the medical horrors, the psychological torture, the system that enabled all of it. And we've seen that survival was possible, just not for most women. So what does all of this mean? What do we take away from this brutal history? And why does it matter now, centuries later? Let's talk numbers. Cold, brutal numbers. Because that's what history left us with. Between 1000 and 1500 AD, across medieval Europe, conservative estimates suggest that over 2 million women died from pregnancy and childbirth complications. 2 million. And that's being generous. Some historians put the number closer to 5 million. 5 million mothers. 5 million girls who never got to grow old. 5 million bodies buried, forgotten, erased from history. 1 in 3 women died from pregnancy-related causes. But that statistic hides something worse. For girls under 16, the mortality rate was closer to 1 in 2. 50%. Flip a coin. Heads you live. Tails you die screaming in a darkened room while your family prays outside. And we don't teach this. History classes skip right over it. Textbooks mention medieval queens, medieval politics, medieval warfare. But the birthing chambers? The child brides? The systematic sacrifice of girls on the altar of dynasty and lineage? That gets a footnote if it's mentioned at all. Why? Because it's uncomfortable. because it forces us to confront the fact that society, for thousands of years, looked at the deaths of women and children and decided it was acceptable. Because it reveals that the glorious medieval period, the age of chivalry and romance and noble knights, was built on a foundation of dead girls. And because it's still happening, right now, today, 12 million girls under 18 are married every year. 12 million. In countries across Africa, South Asia, the Middle East, child marriage is legal, common, expected. Girls as young as 10 are handed over to adult men. And just like in medieval Europe, they get pregnant. And just like in medieval Europe, their bodies aren't ready. Every single day, 500 girls and women die from pregnancy and childbirth complications. Every day. Most of them are in developing countries. Most of them are teenagers. Most of them die from the same things that killed medieval women. Obstructed labor, hemorrhaging, infection. Preventable deaths. Avoidable deaths. Deaths that happen because society still values heirs over mothers. The methods have changed. The justifications have changed. But the result is the same. Girls are still dying because their bodies are being used before they're ready. The medieval period didn't end. It just moved. But let's talk about what did change. Let's talk about why women in wealthy countries don't die in childbirth at medieval rates anymore. Because it didn't happen quickly. And it didn't happen because society suddenly decided women's lives mattered. Maternal mortality stayed high through the 1700s. Through the 1800s. Even into the early 1900s, women were still dying from childbed fever, still dying from hemorrhages, still dying from complications that medieval midwives would have recognized. What changed? 3 things. Germ theory, antibiotics, and the decision to actually educate doctors about obstetrics. In the 1840s, Ignaz Semmelweis proved that washing hands saved lives. Doctors mocked him. In the 1860s, Joseph Lister introduced antiseptic surgery. Doctors resisted. In the 1920s, antibiotics became available. Finally, puerperal fever could be treated. Finally, infections could be stopped. And in the 20th century, medical schools started teaching obstetrics properly. Doctors learned anatomy from actual dissections. They studied labor mechanics. They developed techniques for managing complications. They created blood transfusions, cesarean sections that women could survive, anesthesia that eliminated pain. Maternal mortality dropped. Slowly, but it dropped. In wealthy countries, dying in childbirth became rare instead of common. Expected survival became the norm instead of the exception. But it took until the 1900s. The 1900s. That's how long society tolerated mass death of mothers. That's how many centuries had to pass before anyone bothered to fix the problem. Because the problem was never that solutions didn't exist. The problem was that nobody cared enough to implement them. And even now, in 2025, maternal mortality is rising in some developed countries. The United States has the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed nation. Women, particularly Black women, are dying from pregnancy complications that should be preventable. The system is still broken. The priorities are still wrong. History didn't end. It just evolved. Now let's go back to where we started. That grave in Bologna. The 14-year-old girl with the infant's skull lodged in her pelvis. The archaeological evidence of a death that took hours, maybe days. The physical proof of suffering that no record documented. We don't know her name. The archaeologists couldn't find it. No headstone. No marker. No family records that survived. She's just a skeleton now. A data point in a study about medieval mortality. One of millions who died exactly like she did. But her bones tell the story that history tried to bury. They tell us she was a child. They tell us she was pregnant. They tell us she died in agony. They tell us everything we need to know about what medieval society did to girls. She was someone's daughter, someone's wife. Maybe someone loved her. Maybe they mourned her. Or maybe she was just replaced, forgotten within weeks. Her grave unmarked because her life didn't matter enough to commemorate. We'll never know. But we can remember. We can refuse to let her suffering be invisible. We can tell the truth about what happened to her and the millions like her. We can make sure that when people think about the medieval period, They don't just see castles and crowns. They see the blood. They see the bodies. They see the cost. That's what Throne of Lies exists to do. We are the definitive source for the brutal truths that crowns tried to bury. The uncomfortable histories. The forgotten victims. The stories that power doesn't want told. This video is over. But the work isn't. There are hundreds more stories like this. Rulers who tortured. Systems that killed. Truths that have been hidden for centuries. And we're going to expose every single one. Next time, we're talking about the mad monarchs. The kings and queens whose cruelty wasn't just policy, it was pathology. Rulers who weren't just brutal. They were genuinely insane. And the damage they did makes today's tyrants look tame by comparison. But we need your help to keep going. We need 1,000 subscribers to get the algorithm on our side. Every subscription is a vote to keep these stories alive. These medieval girls are depending on you not to save them because we can't, but to make sure they're never forgotten. Hit subscribe. Takes 2 seconds. Their suffering lasted a lifetime. Don't scroll away. Remember her. The 14-year-old in Bologna. Remember all of them. The ones with names and the ones without. The queens and the peasants. The survivors and the dead. Remember that this happened. Remember that it was allowed to happen. And remember that in some parts of the world, it's still happening. That's the legacy of medieval childbirth. That's the truth that crowns tried to bury. This is Throne of Lies, and we're just getting started.